In 21 days, I was in Kailash. I could barely speak. I took one strand of what is there on that mountain. You won't believe. I was almost 10 to 15 years younger.
A mountain smaller than Everest, never climbed, not once, not by accident, not by force, not by law alone. 4 religions call it sacred. Monks call it something else. What they actually say about Kailash is not a curse or a myth. It is stranger, and it is real. Not that happy, the paradox at the center of it. Mount Kailash rises 6,638 meters above sea level in western Tibet, in the Gangdise range, near the headwaters of 4 of Asia's most important rivers, the Indus, the Sutlej, the Brahmaputra, the Karnali. They all begin their journeys from the same high plateau surrounding this single mountain, carrying water across borders, civilizations, and landscapes before eventually reaching the sea. For thousands of years, this isolated peak has stood at the center of geography, mythology, and faith, dominating the barren Tibetan plateau with an almost unnatural symmetry. 6,638 meters sounds enormous until you put it next to Everest at 8,849, or K2 at 8,611, or even Nanga Parbat at 8,125. Climbers have reached every one of those summits. Climbers have died trying and tried again. The higher and more dangerous peaks have been summited dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of times. Entire careers have been built around conquering mountains that are colder, steeper, and objectively more dangerous than Kailash. Kailash has been summited 0 times. That number needs to stay with you for a moment, because it is the whole puzzle. This is not an unconquered peak in the way the great 8,000ers were unconquered before modern equipment and modern techniques. Kailash is technically achievable. The altitude is not in the death zone. The route is not beyond the capacity of experienced high-altitude mountaineers. The mountain is not unclimbable in any purely physical sense of the word. Modern climbing equipment, weather forecasting, and decades of Himalayan experience have removed many of the obstacles that once made impossible peaks seem unreachable. And yet, 0. The question is not why Kailash has never been climbed despite attempts. The question is why, for over a century of modern mountaineering history, serious climbers have looked at it, assessed it, and then turned around. Not defeated, just turned around. Some mountains challenge the limits of human endurance. Kailash presents a different kind of challenge altogether. It is one of the few places on Earth where the greatest barrier is not ice, altitude, or rock, but something far more unusual. A mountain that could be climbed, yet almost universally isn't. A summit that remains untouched. Not because humanity lacks the ability to stand on it, but because, for reasons stretching far beyond mountaineering, it has chosen not to. A mountain that looks built. Part of what pulls people toward Kailash before they ever encounter the religious traditions surrounding it is the shape. The mountain has 4 faces oriented toward the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. Each face is remarkably steep, almost perfectly defined, and from many angles appears strikingly symmetrical. The geometry has a regularity that strikes observers differently depending on how they come to it. Pilgrims often describe it as sacred. Mountaineers describe it as elegant. Geologists describe it as unusual, but entirely natural. Whatever the perspective, the first impression is often the same. Kailash does not look like an ordinary mountain. Early 20th century European explorers, trained in the survey traditions that were mapping the Himalayas systematically for the first time, noted the unusual visual regularity of the peak in their field reports. They measured its slopes, sketched its ridgelines, and compared it to neighboring mountains. The word that kept appearing was unnatural, not because they believed it had been built, but because its near-perfect proportions seemed so different from the jagged, irregular peaks surrounding it. Against the chaotic skyline of the Tibetan plateau, Kailash stood apart. The geological explanation for this regularity is not mysterious. The Gangdise range is composed of sedimentary and metamorphic rock laid down over immense spans of geological time and later uplifted by the collision of the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates. Millions of years of wind, water, ice, and freeze-thaw erosion sculpted the exposed rock into the steep, sharply defined faces visible today. The specific composition of the rock layers, combined with these long-term erosional processes, can produce unusually regular slopes and geometric ridgelines. Similar, though less dramatic, formations exist elsewhere in the world. The shape of Kailash, while extraordinary, is explainable through standard geological processes. That has not stopped more imaginative theories from emerging. In 1999, a Russian scientist named Ernst Moldashev argued that Kailash was an artificial pyramid, constructed by an ancient civilization and used as a device for focusing cosmic energy. His claim received considerable popular attention and has continued circulating in alternative history communities ever since. It is worth being direct about this. Moldashev's hypothesis was not supported by geological evidence and has been rejected by mainstream science. The mountain is not an artificial structure. The shape is remarkable. It is not constructed, but the shape is how most people encounter Kailash first, and it is what gives the religious tradition surrounding it a visual anchor that feels almost too convenient to be accidental. 4 faces, 4 directions, 4 great religions, 1 mountain, 4 faiths, and 1 answer. The religious significance of Kailash is not a single tradition that spread from one source. It is 4 separate traditions, rooted in different geographies, different theologies, different cosmologies, that each arrived at the same conclusion about the same mountain. In Hinduism, Kailash is the dwelling place of Shiva, one of the 3 principal deities of the Hindu tradition and the Lord of transformation, destruction, and regeneration. The mountain is not a symbol for Shiva or a place that reminds Hindus of Shiva. In the tradition, Shiva actually lives there. The summit is his home. No human being climbs to the home of a god. In Tibetan Buddhism, Kailash is identified with Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of the universe described in Buddhist cosmology. It is the physical axis around which all existence rotates. It is also the earthly home of Demchok, the deity representing supreme bliss. For Tibetan Buddhists, Kailash is not a mountain with spiritual significance. It is the spiritual center of the world expressed in physical form. In Jainism, Kailash is the site where Rishabhanatha, the first of the 24 Tirthankaras or enlightened teachers of the Jain tradition, achieved liberation from the cycle of rebirth. This makes it the most sacred physical location in Jain geography, the place where the spiritual journey that Jainism describes was first completed. In the Bon tradition, the ancient animistic spiritual practice of Tibet that predates Buddhism's arrival in the region, Kailash is the axis mundi, the point where heaven and earth connect. It is where the vertical dimension of existence meets the horizontal one. The sacred 9-story swastika mountain of Bon tradition is identified with Kailash specifically. None of these 4 traditions borrowed this from the others. Hinduism's identification of Kailash with Shiva's dwelling predates the arrival of Buddhism in Tibet. Jainism developed independently from both. Bon is older than Buddhism's presence in the region. 4 separate religious histories, operating from different foundational assumptions, each looked at this specific mountain and said, "Here." What the monks actually say, the most pointed version of the Kailash story that the Tibetan Buddhist tradition tells, is the legend of Milarepa and Naro Bonchung. This is the story that carries the tradition's actual teaching about the mountain, and it is worth understanding on its own terms rather than as colorful folklore. Milarepa was a Buddhist saint who lived in the 11th and 12th centuries. He is one of the most celebrated figures in Tibetan spiritual history, a person who began life committing serious wrongs, turned completely around through intense practice, and achieved realization in a single lifetime. Naro Bonchung was a Bon practitioner, representing the older spiritual tradition of Tibet. The 2 met at Kailash, which both traditions claimed as sacred, and engaged in a contest to determine which tradition would hold the mountain. The story of the contest has several episodes involving displays of spiritual power. The decisive one involves Naro Bonchung rising into the air on his drum, to fly to the summit first. Milarepa, appearing to sleep through the contest, rises at the last moment on a sunbeam and arrives at the summit before Naro Bonchung, who falls and leaves a scar on the south face of the mountain. The scar is real. A large vertical groove runs down the south face of Kailash, visible in photographs and in person. The tradition explains it as the mark left by the drum's fall. The teaching embedded in this story is not about climbing. It is not a warning that the mountain will harm those who attempt to summit it. It is a statement about what kind of capacity the summit represents. The legend says the summit was reached by someone riding a sunbeam, which is the tradition's way of saying that access to what the mountain represents requires a form of realization that ordinary effort and ordinary capacity cannot produce. The message is not physical, but spiritual. This is the actual secret that Tibetan monks carry about Kailash. Not hidden knowledge about what is inside the mountain or what will happen to those who try to climb it. The teaching is that the mountain represents something that cannot be conquered in the way a mountain is normally conquered, by physical effort and technical skill. What the summit represents can only be approached by what the tradition would call a fully realized being. Everyone else is already circling something they cannot reach by going up. When climbers met the mountain, the 20th century record of serious mountaineers encountering Kailash does not contain dramatic failed summit attempts, large-scale rescue operations, or the grim history of bodies left frozen on the mountain. Instead, it presents something quieter, more consistent, and ultimately more intriguing. Again and again, experienced explorers and climbers reached the mountain, assessed it with professional judgment, and chose to walk away. The pattern is not one of repeated failure. It is one of repeated restraint. Sven Hedin, the Swedish explorer whose expeditions mapped vast areas of Tibet during the early 20th century, possessed both the geographical knowledge and the logistical capability to organize an ascent had he wished to do so. He carefully surveyed Kailash as part of his broader exploration of the region, documenting its geography and significance. Yet after examining the mountain, he simply moved on. His writings contain detailed observations of the landscape, but they do not describe any determined effort to conquer the summit. The mountain was acknowledged, studied, and then left behind. A few decades later, the British mountaineer Hugh Rutledge examined the north face of Kailash during an expedition in 1926. He described it as utterly unclimbable. At first glance, that judgment appears surprising. Kailash rises to approximately 6 and a ton, half-thousand meters, a formidable height, but still considerably lower than many Himalayan peaks that would eventually be climbed. More importantly, Rutledge made this assessment during an era when the world's highest mountains had not yet been summited, and standards for what was considered impossible were rapidly changing. His conclusion was therefore not simply a comparison of altitude or technical difficulty. It reflected his assessment of the specific terrain, conditions, and risks presented by that particular face of the mountain at that particular moment. Whether there were additional cultural or personal considerations behind his decision is impossible to know. Colonel R.C. Wilson later attempted to approach the mountain but was forced to turn back because of heavy snow conditions. Weather is the most common reason for abandoning any mountaineering expedition, and there is nothing unusual about retreating when conditions become unsafe. What stands out is that no sustained effort to return was made after conditions improved, despite the obvious appeal of becoming the first person to stand on an unclimbed summit. The Austrian mountaineer Herbert Tichy recorded a conversation with a Tibetan Lama during his travels in the region. According to Tichy's account, the Lama remarked that only a person entirely free of sin could climb Kailash, and that such an individual would not need to climb in the ordinary sense, but would instead fly effortlessly to the summit. Tichy treated the remark with respect, and he never attempted the ascent himself. Perhaps the most significant modern example is Reinhold Messner, widely regarded as one of the greatest high-altitude mountaineers in history, and the first person to climb all 14 8,000-meter peaks without supplemental oxygen. Accounts differ on whether Messner was offered permission to climb Kailash, or whether he declined the opportunity himself. The details vary depending on the source, but the central fact remains unchanged. He never attempted the mountain and repeatedly expressed the view that Kailash should remain unclimbed out of respect for its religious significance. Across more than a century of modern mountaineering history, involving individuals with the skill, experience, equipment, and ambition to reach virtually every major summit on Earth, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. They came to Kailash. They evaluated the mountain with the eyes of climbers, and then, for reasons that were sometimes practical, sometimes cultural, and sometimes deeply personal, they chose to leave without attempting to stand on its summit. The three locks. The reason Kailash remains unclimbed is not a single mystery with a single answer. It is the result of three separate forces, each operating independently, that have together produced the same outcome. Remove any one of them, and the history of the mountain might have been different. Together, however, they have created an extraordinary situation unlike that of any other major peak on Earth. The first lock is religious. For the hundreds of millions of Hindus, Tibetan Buddhists, Jains, and Bon practitioners for whom this mountain carries the deepest possible spiritual significance, climbing it would be an act of profound desecration. This is not a mild cultural preference or a regional custom that outsiders might reasonably set aside. It is the considered position of four distinct religious traditions, each of which regards Kailash as a place of exceptional sanctity. For Hindus, it is the earthly abode of Shiva. Tibetan Buddhists associate it with Demchok, the embodiment of supreme bliss. Jains believe it is the place where the first Tirthankara attained liberation, while followers of the Bon tradition regard it as the spiritual center of their ancient faith. Although these traditions differ in theology, they converge on one principle: the summit is not meant to be conquered. That shared conviction has shaped how the very idea of climbing Kailash is understood, discussed, and ultimately rejected. The second lock is legal. The mountain lies within Chinese-controlled Tibet, where all major mountaineering expeditions require official government approval. The Chinese authorities have never issued a permit for a summit attempt on Kailash. Throughout the Himalayas and the Tibetan plateau, climbing is regulated through a system of explicit authorization for individual peaks and established routes. In the case of Kailash, that authorization has consistently been withheld. The legal barrier is therefore not the result of administrative delay or bureaucratic oversight. It reflects a deliberate policy that aligns, at least in practice, with the religious sensitivity surrounding the mountain. The third lock is the position adopted by the mountaineering community itself. This is perhaps the least discussed and in many ways the most revealing of the three. Elite climbers have built their reputations by reaching summits that others considered impossible. The first ascent of an unclimbed peak is among the greatest achievements in mountaineering, and history is filled with expeditions driven by precisely that ambition. Yet Kailash has inspired a remarkably different response. Many of the world's most accomplished climbers have concluded that the mountain should remain untouched, not because they doubt it can be climbed, but because they believe it should not be. Reinhold Messner expressed this view publicly, and his position reflects a broader consensus that has gradually developed within the climbing community. The important distinction is therefore not between unclimbed and unclimbable. Kailash is not a wall that human beings are incapable of crossing. It is a door that has remained closed because religion, law, and the ethics of mountaineering have all independently pointed toward the same decision: what is allowed instead. While the summit remains untouched, Kailash is not a mountain that people stay away from. It is one of the most actively visited pilgrimage sites on Earth. The Kora is a 52-kilometer circumambulation of the mountain, a walk around its base that passes through high terrain, including the Dolma Pass at 5,600 meters. For the traditions that regard Kailash as sacred, completing the Kora is an act of deep devotion and spiritual merit. Pilgrims from across South Asia and Tibet have walked this circuit for centuries. Some complete it in the standard manner, walking the path over 2 to 3 days. Some complete it through full prostration, lying face down on the ground, standing moving to where their hands were and lying down again, covering the entire 52 kilometers in this manner over weeks. The inner kora, a shorter circuit closer to the mountain, is restricted further. Some traditions hold that only those who have completed a certain number of outer koras should attempt the inner one. 2026 is the Tibetan Year of the Horse, which occurs in a 12-year cycle. Completing the kora during the Year of the Horse is traditionally believed to multiply the spiritual merit of the circumambulation by 13 times. Surges in pilgrimage activity at Kailash during horse years have been recorded consistently through the modern era. The route to Kailash has been opening further after a multi-year suspension related to access restrictions. The first group of pilgrims traveling through the Nathula border crossing completed the journey in 2025. The physical infrastructure around the pilgrimage route has been improved, and new air connections have reduced the travel time to reach the western Tibet region significantly. The access is changing. The answer is not. The old argument that Kailash remained unclimbed because of its sheer inaccessibility has steadily weakened over the past few decades. The remoteness that once made reaching the mountain a major expedition has been significantly reduced by modern infrastructure across western Tibet. Paved highways now connect areas that were once accessible only by long caravan routes, while the development of Alikunsha Airport and expanded flight connections from major Chinese cities have made the region far easier to reach than at any other point in history. Getting to the base of Kailash today requires only a fraction of the time, planning, and physical effort that it demanded a century ago. What was once a months-long logistical challenge has become a journey that, while still difficult because of the altitude, is no longer defined by isolation. The practical barriers that once discouraged any serious climbing expedition have largely disappeared. Yet the number of summit attempts remains exactly the same. Conservation has also become an increasingly important part of the conversation. The landscape surrounding Kailash contains fragile high-altitude ecosystems, sensitive wetlands, and the headwaters of 4 of Asia's most important river systems. Large-scale mountaineering activity would inevitably leave a physical footprint on an environment that is both delicate and difficult to restore. Unlike the religious argument, the conservation case does not depend on sacred tradition or spiritual belief. It is based entirely on protecting a unique natural environment from unnecessary human impact. What makes Kailash remarkable is that 4 entirely different lines of reasoning all arrive at the same conclusion. Religious traditions regard the summit as sacred. The Chinese government has never authorized an ascent. The mountaineering community has largely chosen to respect the mountain rather than conquer it. Conservationists argue that the surrounding ecosystem should remain undisturbed. Independent of one another, each reaches the same destination. The summit should remain untouched. Anecdotal layer. Any honest account of Kailash has to acknowledge that the experiences people bring back from time spent near the mountain often include things that do not fit neatly into conventional categories. These accounts are rarely dramatic in the way popular stories or internet myths suggest. Instead, they tend to describe subtle but deeply personal changes in perception, emotion, and awareness that are difficult to communicate to someone who has never been there. Pilgrims and trekkers have reported an unusual clarity of thought, vivid and exceptionally memorable dreams, an intensified awareness of their surroundings, and a persistent feeling of being observed or accompanied even when they were physically alone. Others describe an overwhelming sense of peace, an altered perception of time, or a feeling of presence that they struggle to express in ordinary language. What makes these reports noteworthy is not that they all describe the same experience, because they do not, but that they come from people with very different religious beliefs, cultural backgrounds, and expectations. Some arrive convinced they are approaching one of the world's holiest places. Others come out of curiosity, with no particular spiritual commitments at all. Despite those differences, certain themes appear with surprising regularity. The most responsible way to approach these accounts is to begin with what is already well understood about the effects of extreme altitude on the human body and mind. Kailash sits at an elevation where oxygen availability is significantly reduced, and many visitors spend days walking between 5,000 and 6,000 meters above sea level. Under these conditions, the brain responds to hypoxia in ways that can alter perception, heighten emotional sensitivity, intensify dreams, and produce unusually vivid mental imagery. Prolonged exposure to cold, fatigue, dehydration, and intense ultraviolet radiation adds further physiological stress. At the same time, the psychological context matters. People who have traveled thousands of kilometers to visit a place they believe is sacred are naturally more attentive to their thoughts, emotions, and surroundings, making meaningful experiences feel even more significant. None of the anecdotal accounts associated with Kailash require a supernatural explanation. They remain entirely consistent with what researchers know about the combined effects of altitude, physiology, and expectation on human perception. Presenting them as evidence of unexplained forces would go beyond what the available evidence supports. What continues to interest researchers, historians, and visitors alike is not the extraordinary nature of any single story, but the remarkable consistency of certain themes across individuals who have never met one another and who begin their journeys with very different expectations of what they might find. The Actual Secret. The title of this piece promises a secret. Here it is, stated plainly. The secret of Kailash is not hidden text. It is not ancient technology. It is not something buried under the mountain or encoded in its geometry. The secret is that four completely unrelated religious traditions, a national government, an international mountaineering community, and a global conservation movement have all landed on the same restraint about the same mountain without coordinating. Religion did not tell the mountaineers what to do. The mountaineers did not tell the government what to permit. The government did not shape the religious traditions. The conservationists came to the table last and reached the same conclusion independently. Four different categories of human institution, operating from four different value systems, pointing in the same direction. The monks teaching about Kailash, that the summit is accessible only through a form of realization that ordinary effort cannot produce, turns out to describe something true about the mountain in a way that has nothing to do with the supernatural. The mountain remains unclimbed, not because it cannot be climbed in a physical sense, but because something about it has consistently produced, across a century of modern history and across completely different institutional contexts, the choice to leave it alone. Pilgrims walk the circuit below. They look up at a summit that nobody has stood on. They circle something rather than ascending it, and in the tradition that surrounds the mountain, the circling is the whole point. Nobody knows if that will ever change. Every generation since 1926 has had climbers bold enough to try. Every single one walked away instead. That is the real story of Kailash. If mysteries like this pull you in, subscribe because there is more waiting for you.